Analysis. At the 12th Summit of the Organization of Turkic States, held in October 2025 in Gabala, Azerbaijan, under the theme of Regional Peace and Security, Azerbaijan formally proposed hosting the organization's first-ever joint military exercises, now scheduled for 2026. The Gabala Declaration introduced an OTS Plus format designed to deepen cooperation with non-member partner states. According to analysis published in the American Journal of Social and Humanitarian Research in March 2026, the OTS has begun a formal transition from a cultural and economic body into what researchers are characterizing as a military strategic union. The Robert Lansing Institute's detailed December 2025 analysis described the OTS as having transformed under Turkey's increasingly assertive leadership from a cultural forum into what it characterized as a dynamic geopolitical bloc. Its member states, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan, with Hungary as an observer, represent a combined population of over 175 million people, with substantial energy reserves and control over critical Eurasian trade corridors. Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev has explicitly called for a treaty on strategic partnership, eternal friendship, and brotherhood of Turkic states. The Times of Central Asia has described Turkey's role in this process as the Turkic Gambit. The Hudson Institute's Luke Coffey, reporting on the Gabala Summit, noted that the military exercises proposal was unprecedented in the organization's history. The drone revolution and defense architecture shift. The structural shift in Central Asian defense procurement is inseparable from Turkey's defense industrial expansion. The Armenian Weekly's October 2025 analysis documented that Baykar, the Turkish defense manufacturer led by CEO Selçuk Bayraktar, who is also President Erdogan's son-in-law, commands approximately 65% of the worldwide UAV export market as of February 2025, selling to 34 countries. In 2024, Baykar alone represented 25% of Turkey's total military exports, which reached $7.15 billion that year. 5 Turkish defense firms, Aselsan, TÜBİTAK, Roketsan, Asfat, and MKE, are now ranked among Defense News's top 100 most valuable defense companies globally. The operational record of Turkish drone systems has driven procurement decisions across the Turkic world. Forbes documented how Kyrgyzstan used Turkish drones to achieve decisive outcomes in border conflicts. Azerbaijan used them to reclaim Nagorno-Karabakh from Armenia in 44 days, a conflict that Russia, Armenia's supposed security guarantor, was unable to prevent or reverse. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are now purchasing these systems, in the process systematically replacing Soviet-era Russian weapons with Turkish technology. The strategic implication of that procurement shift is structural. Turkish drone systems are compatible with NATO standards, not Russian ones. The Central Asian republics are integrating into a NATO-adjacent defense architecture. Russia is being excluded from an architecture it once dominated, not through external imposition, but through the purchasing decisions of states that had previously been dependent on Russian military supply. Kazakhstan's energy pivot, rerouting oil outside Russia. For decades, Moscow held Kazakhstan's energy exports in a chokehold through pipeline control. The Caspian Pipeline Consortium, carrying over 80% of Kazakhstan's crude exports to a terminal on Russia's Black Sea coast, was the primary mechanism. Kazakhstan had no viable alternative route. That dependency is being systematically dismantled. As reported by the Pipeline Technology Journal in August 2025, Kazakhstan's Energy Minister Yerlan Akhenjanov announced a dramatic scaling of oil exports through the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, the BTC, routing oil through Azerbaijan and Turkey entirely outside Russian territory. The target is 1.7 million tons through the BTC in 2025, up from 1.4 million tons in 2024. Kazakhstan's oil production trajectory compounds the strategic significance of the routing change. Production is projected to rise from 87.6 million tons in 2024 to 96.2 million tons in 2025, with analysts projecting it will exceed 100 million tons annually within years, backed by approximately $21 billion in committed investment through 2030. As GIS reports documented in March 2025, Kazakhstan is deliberately constructing westward export routes that bypass Russian territory, a motivated strategic decoupling that followed directly from Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. The sanctions enforcement dimension. Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service confirmed in December 2025, as reported by the Kyiv Post, that Kazakhstan had introduced sweeping new export controls, mandating licensing for exports of goods subject to Western sanctions, and dramatically enhancing monitoring of EU, US, and UK origin products. Kazakhstan is not formally joining the Western sanctions regime, but the SCR's assessment was explicit. Astana is demonstrating its readiness to narrow Russia's access to goods critical to its defense industrial complex. Russia had relied on Kazakhstan as one of its primary routes for sanctioned technology, microelectronics, drone components, dual-use materials, into its defense industrial supply chain. In October 2025, reports confirmed more than 5,000 trucks queuing at the Russian-Kazakh border as the new controls took hold. Russia is being subjected to supply chain pressure not only by Western governments, but by a neighbor that no longer fears retribution for enforcing that pressure. Analysts assessing the shift have characterized it in terms of a single indicator. Kazakhstan now fears U.S. secondary sanctions more than Putin's reaction. When a dependent state's fear calculus inverts, the dependency relationship has ended. The Caspian Sea and the Middle Corridor. Russian naval dominance of the Caspian Sea has been a three-century strategic reality. The Caspian is the only viable route for Central Asian energy to reach European markets without transiting Russian or Iranian territory, making its control a gatekeeper mechanism of substantial value. The Central Asia Caucasus analyst has reported that Turkic-backed states are actively challenging this arrangement. Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan are constructing their own Caspian fleets, supported by Turkish technology and strategic partnerships. Turkmenistan is building ports that bypass Russian territory. If Russia loses control of Caspian transit, it loses the ability to act as a gatekeeper, toll collector, and potential cutoff threat. The energy leverage mechanism that was Moscow's most powerful instrument over European and Central Asian states for decades. The Caspian shift is structurally linked to what trade analysts call the Middle Corridor, a trade route linking China to European markets through Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Turkey, and the Caspian Sea, bypassing Russian territory entirely. China is investing substantially in this corridor. The European Union is investing substantially. The OTS Secretary-General Kubanich-Bek Omarali recently visited Washington for meetings with U.S. government officials, a signal, noted by the Hudson Institute, that Washington is beginning to assess the strategic importance of the emerging bloc. The northern corridor through Russia was killed by Western sanctions. The middle corridor is the replacement, and its development does not require Russia's participation or consent. Internal pressure. Ethnic minority mobilization. Charter 97, the Belarusian opposition outlet, has reported that Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, the GUR, has officially formed a union of indigenous peoples, bringing together Tatars, Bashkirs, Buryats, and Chechens, all fighting against Moscow under their own distinct national flags. The unit represents individuals from nationalities within the Russian Federation who chose to fight against the Russian military rather than within it. Chechen fighters serving in Ukraine on the Ukrainian side are, according to Charter 97 reporting, not fighting exclusively for Kyiv. They are building combat experience while preparing for a return to the North Caucasus. They have observed that the Russian military, the supposedly invincible force of Kremlin propaganda, is breakable. The Moscow Times has reported that analysts tracking the North Caucasus anticipate continued upheaval through 2025 and beyond, with forced conscription raids in Chechnya, Dagestan, and Ingushetia generating deep resentment. The structural risk identified by these analysts is straightforward. If Kadyrov's arrangement with Moscow collapses, through death, political miscalculation, or popular uprising, the North Caucasus does not remain quiet. Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, resource-rich Muslim republics in Russia's Volga-Ural region, sit atop significant oil reserves and major petrochemical infrastructure. These are wealthy regions by Russian standards, or they would be if extracted revenue remained local. It does not. Moscow extracts the revenue and returns subsidies and conscription notices. Foreign Policy's November 2025 investigation into Russia's ethnic minorities documented the consequences. Regional budgets across Russia's periphery are collapsing under war spending and shrinking central transfers. The budget numbers tell the structural story. Russia's 2026 budget will cut funding for 18 of 51 state programs, while spending on police, the National Guard, and internal security agencies will rise by 13% to a record $47 billion. The Kremlin is reducing services for its citizens while increasing spending to control them. It is the budget of a regime anticipating internal disorder, not one managing a secure imperial periphery. The demographic arithmetic. The ethnic Russian population of the Russian Federation is under compounding pressure. The war has killed and disabled hundreds of thousands of military-age men, the overwhelming majority from ethnic Russian communities and minority populations outside major urban centers. Brain drain has removed an estimated 700,000 or more educated Russians from the country since 2022, according to Forbes reporting citing Kremlin sources. Meanwhile, Muslim and Turkic populations within Russia's borders are the only major demographic group that is growing. In the Volga-Ural republics, in the North Caucasus, in Siberia. The demographic trajectory of the Russian Federation is moving in a direction that makes Putin's vision of an ethnically Russian imperial state mathematically unsustainable within a generation. The alphabet as civilizational declaration. In September 2024, the Commission on the Common Alphabet of the Turkic World agreed on a 34-letter common alphabet based on the Latin script, a coordinated move away from the Cyrillic alphabet imposed during Soviet rule. Kazakhstan is switching to Latin. Uzbekistan has already made the transition. In October 2025, Turkey's Ministry of Education officially replaced the term Central Asia with Turkestan across its entire national curriculum. The Cyrillic script was Moscow's mechanism for tethering Central Asian populations to the Russian information environment, to Russian cultural production, to Russian institutional identity. By abandoning Cyrillic and adopting Latin, these nations are not simply changing orthography, they are aligning their internet infrastructure, their educational systems, and their cultural futures with Ankara and the broader Western information environment. They are making it progressively harder for their populations to be reached by Russian-language content and progressively easier to access Turkish, Western, and NATO-adjacent cultural production. Historian Maxim Kuznetsov has stated publicly that the collapse Putin is producing may not originate in Moscow. It may begin in the North Caucasus or in the oil-rich republics of Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, where populations live on resource wealth while their infrastructure deteriorates and their sons return in zinc coffins. The Zangezur Corridor and Russia's geographic exposure. The Zangezur Corridor, a strip of land running through Armenia that would, if opened, create a direct land connection between Turkey and Azerbaijan, is one of the most geopolitically significant pieces of contested geography in the current Eurasian environment, receiving disproportionately little Western analytical attention. For a century, Russian-drawn borders in the South Caucasus specifically fragmented Turkic territorial continuity, preventing any contiguous Turkic bloc from forming that could challenge Moscow's intermediary role. The Zangezur Corridor, if completed, would allow uninterrupted land transit from Istanbul to Almaty without entering Russian or Iranian territory. Azerbaijan, backed by Turkey, is actively pursuing this opening. A truck route connecting Istanbul to Central Asia outside Russian and Iranian territory eliminates Russia's physical gatekeeper position in the South Caucasus and connects directly to the Middle Corridor, completing the geographic infrastructure of a Eurasian trade architecture that excludes Moscow from its logistics map. The information channel bypassing Kremlin censorship. Soldiers of the Siberian Battalion, the Turan Battalion, and Bashkir and Tatar units fighting under Ukrainian colors are recording videos in their native languages, Tatar, Yakut, Bashkir, and distributing them through Telegram and TikTok, bypassing Russian state media censorship structures entirely. The message being transmitted to their home communities is specific. Moscow is using them as cannon fodder. They are dying for an empire that has never regarded their survival as a priority. The war is colonial in structure and they are the colony. According to analysts cited by Radio Free Europe, this information flow is awakening national consciousness that Russian state mechanisms had suppressed for a century. The channel, smartphones, encrypted messaging, social platforms, is not one the Kremlin controls. It arrives in private messages between family members and former classmates. It carries the credibility of individuals the recipients know, rather than the institutional credibility of either Ukrainian or Russian state sources. Mongolia, Vladivostok, and the Far Eastern dimension. Charter 97 has reported protests in Vladivostok, Russia's Pacific port city, the largest seen there in years, triggered by heating system collapse while coal-bearing ships destined for China sailed past the city's population. The image encapsulates the colonial extraction dynamic of Putin's Eastern policy. The resources of the Russian Far East are exported to fund a war thousands of miles away, while the people living atop those resources cannot heat their homes in winter. Mongolia presents a specific strategic variable. Putin requires the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline to transit Mongolian territory to deliver Siberian gas to China, the critical component of his energy pivot from European to Asian markets following Western sanctions. Ulaanbaatar is stalling. Mongolia is observing the rise of the Turkic Bloc, the U.S. interest in Central Asian partnerships, and calculating whether a continued economic dependency on Russia is preferable to a new strategic alignment. If Mongolia declines the pipeline transit, Russia's Asian energy pivot, the financial mechanism designed to replace European revenue lost to sanctions, loses its primary delivery architecture. Turkey's soft power architecture in Central Asia. Turkey's strategic position in the Turkic world is not solely a product of drone sales and military exercises. It rests on a decades-long soft power investment that has created a generational shift in how Central Asian populations orient themselves culturally, economically, and politically. While Russia has been deploying military assets in Ukraine, Turkey has been building schools, cultural centers, and television production infrastructure across Central Asia and the South Caucasus. Turkish construction companies have been active throughout Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. The Turkish Cooperation and Coordination Agency, TICA, has funded development projects across the region for decades. Student exchange programs send Central Asian youth to Turkish universities, producing graduates whose professional networks and cultural references are oriented toward Ankara rather than Moscow. The Turkish television drama industry has been particularly significant. Turkish-produced series, historical epics, contemporary dramas, cultural programming are watched by hundreds of millions of viewers across the Turkic world and beyond. These productions are not state propaganda in the Soviet sense. They are commercially produced entertainment that happens to depict Turkic history, culture, and contemporary life in ways that resonate with Central Asian audiences who have grown up with Russian-language media. The cultural pull of Turkish content, operating commercially through streaming platforms and satellite television, is not controllable by Moscow and requires no political directive from Ankara. The model Turkey has successfully presented to Central Asian populations is specifically not the colonial model. Turkey brings construction companies rather than occupying forces. It sends teachers rather than political officers. It offers student exchanges rather than conscription quotas. It exports television rather than extracting resources. The contrast with the Soviet and post-Soviet Russian model, extraction of regional wealth, suppression of local culture, forced military service, is not theoretical. It is visible in daily life comparisons that Central Asian populations can make directly. Ankara has positioned itself as what one regional analyst has characterized as the new elder brother of the Turkic world, the most powerful, most developed, and most internationally connected member of a family of states, without the imperial arrogance that made Moscow's version of that relationship intolerable over time. The Russia-China relationship and its Central Asian implications. China's investment in the Middle Corridor has a dimension that is analytically significant beyond its effect on Russia's logistics position. China's interest in a Central Asian trade route that bypasses Russia is not primarily about denying Russia transit revenues. It is about supply chain resilience and the geopolitical risk management associated with excessive dependence on Russian territory for Chinese exports to European markets. Russia's vulnerability to sanctions and the speed with which Western sanctions disrupted the northern corridor through Russian territory demonstrated to Chinese planners that a trade architecture with Russia as a critical node carries geopolitical risk. The Middle Corridor, by routing through Caspian, Caucasian, and Turkish territory, distributes that risk across multiple jurisdictions, none of which are currently subject to comprehensive Western sanctions, and most of which have commercial incentives to maintain functional relations with both East and West. China's Belt and Road investment in Kazakhstan and the broader Central Asian corridor therefore serve simultaneously. Commercial supply chain diversification, geopolitical risk reduction, and indirect pressure on Russia's position as an indispensable Eurasian intermediary. Beijing is not coordinating this with Washington. It is pursuing its own commercial and strategic interests, which, in the specific case of Central Asian transit infrastructure, happen to align with the Western interest in reducing Russia's gatekeeper capacity. The long-term scenario and its variables. The Turkic Bloc's trajectory is directional rather than inevitable. Several variables could alter the pace or extent of the transformation. The Ukraine war's outcome is the most immediate variable. A Russian military recovery that produced a settlement favorable to Moscow might partially restore the fear dynamic that previously kept Central Asian states from moving as decisively as they are now. However, the energy infrastructure investments, the military procurement contracts, the alphabet transition, and the trade route construction are physical and institutional changes that do not reverse easily, even if the political environment shifts. The U.S. engagement variable is significant. The OTS Secretary General's Washington visit signals the beginning of American institutional recognition of the bloc. If the United States develops a coherent policy framework for engaging the OTS, treating it as a strategic partner in Eurasian security architecture rather than a peripheral cultural organization, the bloc's development would accelerate substantially. If Washington treats the OTS as a secondary priority relative to other strategic commitments, the trajectory continues at its current pace rather than accelerating. The China-Turkey relationship is a structural uncertainty. Turkey and China have complex, overlapping interests in Central Asia that are not uniformly cooperative. China's economic penetration of Kazakhstan and the broader region is occurring alongside Turkey's military and cultural penetration. Whether those two vectors produce friction or complementarity as they develop will significantly affect the region's political orientation. A Central Asia that has to choose between Chinese economic dependence and Turkish cultural affiliation faces a different choice architecture than one in which those two influences reinforce each other. The internal Russian variable is the most long-term and the most difficult to assess. The decolonization movement inside Russia's ethnic republics is real in its early expressions. Soldiers under their own flags, telegram channels in Tatar and Yakut, budget cuts generating resentment in resource-rich peripheries. Whether that movement develops toward effective political pressure, toward armed resistance, or toward continued suppressed resentment within a functioning Russian state depends on factors: leadership, opportunity, coordination, international support that are not currently determinate. What is analytically clear is the directionality. Every structural indicator, pipeline routing, weapons procurement, alphabet commissions, military exercises, trade corridor investment, demographic trends, is moving away from Moscow and toward the OTS-centered architecture Turkey is building. The speed of that movement has accelerated since 2022. The trajectory, absent a dramatic reversal in Russian military and political fortunes, has no mechanism currently visible that would reverse it. The structural reversal. Putin's stated objectives in launching the Ukraine war included preventing NATO's eastward expansion, demonstrating Russian military power, and reasserting Russian dominance over post-Soviet space. The outcomes achieved in the Eurasian interior move in the opposite direction on each axis. Kazakhstan is rerouting oil outside Russian territory and enforcing sanctions restrictions on Russian-bound goods. Uzbekistan has converted to a Latin alphabet. The OTS is scheduling its first joint military exercises. The Zangezur corridor is under active pursuit. The Middle Corridor is under active construction. Turkic units are fighting against the Russian military from within Russia's own ethnic periphery. China is investing in transit routes that do not require Russian territory. The United States is engaging OTS leadership in Washington. The prison of nations was held together through fear. The war in Ukraine moved the fear calculation. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, and Kyrgyzstan now assess that secondary sanctions from Washington are a more immediate risk than Moscow's displeasure. When that calculus inverts, the dependency relationships that held the structure together stop functioning. The decolonization process does not require a single dramatic rupture. It proceeds through pipeline rerouting decisions, procurement contracts, alphabet commissions, and military exercise proposals, each individually manageable and collectively irreversible.